This is Drummer Hodge by Thomas Hardy, 1840 to 1928. That's his life, not the poems. And Thomas Hardy is both a Victorian and a 20th century man. And he's not typical of a lot of the poets that we study either just for fun or for exams like A-level English literature. Thomas Hardy was the son of a stonemason. His parents were married less than 6 months before he was born. Make up your own mind about that. He trained as an architect. He built his own house with the help of his brother. He's most famous for writing novels. At the age of 16, he watched the hanging of Martha Brown, who was hung for the murder of her husband, and this is thought to have influenced the model of the death of Tess in his novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles. He wrote many other novels that were to become famous. Far from the Madding Crowd is one, Mayor of Casterbridge, Jude the Obscure. So he wrote novels until around about 1898, 1897, I think, actually, when he wrote his last novel, The Well-Beloved. I think his novels were becoming less well received, so he gave up writing novels because he didn't like criticism, and he started publishing poems, and his first collection was published in 1898. And Drummer Hodge is set at about that time. It is written about the Boer War, and the Boer War was a war in South Africa between the English and Dutch descendants known as the Afrikaans in South Africa. The indigenous people of South Africa kind of got caught up in the middle between this battle of empires, which did nobody any good, most particularly the young drummer Hodge. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on Thomas Hardy. We can talk a bit more about Thomas Hardy later on, but now to the poem. Now, when approaching a poem in an exam, to offset panic, I personally recommend just going with a strategy, just to ease yourself in. If you can't think of anything to say about the poem, either because it's an unseen poem or because you've just forgotten everything you learned, then go for this strategy, which is first of all to look at rhyme scheme, form and metre. Those are important aspects of any poem. Some of them are very evident, some of them not so much. But once you've examined them, started to talk about them, it can give you a grasp on how to approach the poem, how to write a first sentence, how to just get into talking about a poem. So in this case, there is a rhyme scheme, and as you can see, it goes A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. And if you were to carry on, you would find that that alternating rhyme scheme would continue. So that's the first thing that you can say about a poem. It's got a rhyme scheme or it hasn't, and if it has got a rhyme scheme, is it a formal rhyme scheme or is it a little bit all over the place? Does it have internal rhyme or forced rhyme or any of those other things? In this case, we've got a standard alternating rhyme scheme, which can be quite difficult to adhere to if you are the poet. Okay, next, form. That basically means, what does it look like? What is its form? So in this case, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In this case, you've got 6 lines per stanza, which makes it a sestet. So when you've established both rhyme scheme and form, then it's worth having a look at metre, which is really just the beat of a poem, which can be difficult. So you count syllables: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have a bit of caesura there. So it seems to have 8 and 6, iambic being one unstressed and one stressed syllable, 8 syllables divide into 4 pairs, which are called feet, and 6 syllables divide into 3 pairs, which are called feet. So that's usually how it's put. So now you've got something to say about form, about metre, and of course about rhyme scheme. It's often then worth looking at the title. Sometimes it's relevant, sometimes it's not. In this case, this does give some of the context of the poem. Drummers of the army were usually young teenage boys. They had nothing else to do but beat the drum, and the sound of the drum was the sound of the continuing battle. If you could hear the drum, then you knew you were still in the fight. The drummer was also a target. If you could stop the drum, then you could damage the morale of the fighters. He's called Drummer Hodge, so he's given a kind of rank. Even though he's young, he's got a formal mode of address. So the onset of the poem, the beginning of the poem, is they throw in Drummer Hodge to rest. They throw, collective pronoun, gives you an idea of just a set of guys. And the dynamic verb throw is quite harsh, really. It isn't something that you would expect someone to be doing with a body, let alone the body of a child. They throw him in. It represents the tiredness, the difficulty, the exhaustion of the men who are putting this boy to rest. And rest, of course, is a euphemism. It's a euphemism for death. So the very first line gives you a whole atmosphere. They throw and they put him to rest, but it's not really a burial or a ritual. He is uncoffined. The negative prefix gives you that idea that he hasn't got a coffin, but there's no real explanation here. It's very economic. He just hasn't got a coffin. So the whole image is harsh and warlike, and of course when writers present their information like this, it's often as part of a protest. There's a bit of caesura there, which I often want to spell as Caesar, but no, it's caesura. And justice found, of course, is another element of the poem. You can see too here there's not much punctuation between rest and uncoffined, which allows for enjambment, although there are colons at the end of alternating lines, which gives a strong pause. But justice found is, again, unceremonious. Nothing is done for him. There's nothing to do for him. He's dead, and it's part of the tragedy of war, and they just get on with it, perhaps because they can't think about it. His landmark is a copia crest. I hope I got the pronunciation right. That's a local language. It is the language of the Afrikaners, Afrikaans, and it means a small hill. So it's just a word for a small hill. So they've buried him under a mound, basically, that breaks the veldt. Again, that's a local language for the savannah. It's not really desert, it's a bit different it's got something in it, scrub and trees, but it's also wide and vast. And then Hardy begins to get to some of the sadness of this moment, if we're not sad enough already. The foreign constellations, the stars of the southern hemisphere. These are the stars under which he's buried, but not the stars that you would expect a boy from England to be buried under. And it emphasises the strangeness of where he is. Any mother would want to feel that their child had something familiar to look at, even though you know the child is dead. Young Hodge. Second stanza begins with young Hodge, an adjective that emphasises his youth. We've gone from the formality of Drummer Hodge to the description of him as young. So we know, most people would have known at the time, that this is a very young man, if not a boy, but he's making sure we know. Young Hodge, the drummer, never knew. Fresh from his Wessex home. More caesura. So there's strong negativity. And Wessex is a fictional county that Hardy created for his novels, which is basically the West Country, but it doesn't have to be Dorset or Somerset or Cornwall. It can be a generic county, and it was based on the boundaries of medieval times, or in fact pre-medieval times, the boundaries of the tribes at the time of King Arthur. So he harks back to an Englishness here and makes that the home of Drummer Hodge, like the heroes of many of his novels. fresh from his Wessex home. I haven't highlighted that, but fresh is kind of a strong description of new, and freshman, if you think of freshman, it's always young, it's always inexperienced. And then fresh from his Wessex home, the meaning of the Broad Karoo, so that relates back to the first line, he never knew the meaning of the Broad Karoo, which is another local language word for the desert. He never came to know it, he never came to know why he was there or what he was fighting for. And then Hardy carries on with that idea, the bush, which he capitalises, maybe he personifies it, the dusty loam, dusty is a pre-modifier, and loam means soil. So you've got a triadic there, the karoo, the bush, and the dusty loam. And none of this means anything to young drummer Hodge. He doesn't get it, doesn't understand why he's there. He just had to go for whatever reasons. Perhaps because his parents sent him, or because he needed money, or because he volunteered and thought it would be an adventure. It has not ended well. And why uprose to nightly view strange stars amid the gloam? So again, that it is the nightly view. There is this idea that every night this buried boy will look up above to strange stars. He isn't home, he's lonely. And there's nothing there that would help him or help mark him out, let alone anything else. Gloam means twilight. Twilight often signifies death. And yet portion of that unknown plain will Hodge forever be, his homely northern breast and brain. So forever be, of course, is the finality of death. His homely northern breast and brain. I don't think northern here means north of England, because he's from Wessex. It's the northern hemisphere that he's talking about. A word pairing and alliteration there, breast and brain, grow to some southern tree. So he's rotting into the ground and fertilising a southern tree. And strange eyes, another compound adjective here. Constellation, rain, his stars eternally. So again, strange eyes, his strange eyes. If he could think, feel, be alive, it would always be strange. And of course he'll never go home, because this is where he rests. Cheerful poem, really. Very sad. There are photographs online of the Boer War drummer boys. They were young, usually dressed in red, which made them a bit of a target, and often ended badly. It's worth noting, as I said earlier on, that Hardy bridges the Victorian period through to the 20th century, from religious and pious to secular, and his poetry reflects that. So the Victorian era, some of the poems in the Victorian period that are discussed in the A-level Edexcel syllabus start in the middle of the Victorian era, middle of the 19th century, whereas Hardy doesn't start writing poetry until 1898, and Queen Victoria died in 1901. So his poetry is barely Victorian. He was a Victorian, but he looks forward to the 20th century much more in his poetry than back at Victorian values. And Drummer Hodge is about the harshness of war. It's the beginning of protest. And as later on the war came and he lived through the war right through till 1928, other poets took up that clarion call, that anti-war voice, which is heard less in other poets. In fact, Tennyson, who is also on the list, famously wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade, which was in praise of one of Britain's great failures at war, and much more about the bravery and glory of death than the misery and alienation that is suffered by drummer Hodge.